And we're the bride that finally we see him face to face. Every time you take that cup of communion, remember you are betrothed. You're bought with a price. You're no longer your own. You belong to him. You're his. You're betrothed to him. The cup that you have. Jesus says, I'll give you an access to my Holy of Holies. You break the bread, that'll put you through the veil. But when you come into my presence, remember what Jesus said? He said, I'll not drink this cup with you again until you come into my presence. I believe the first thing that will happen as we as a church are raptured, we're going into a bridal chamber. And Jesus is going to say, well done, good and faithful servant, my bride. Come, drink this cup, and we'll be forever together, never to be separated. We only understood what the table of the Lord is preparing for us. It's access into that Kodesh HaKodeshim, that bridal chamber, where we can become intimate with the Messiah. There was a requirement for coming to the Passover table, and that requirement was that everyone had to be circumcised. And you see, circumcision now is not necessary in the flesh. It's the circumcision of the heart. In other words, when we become a believer, our hearts are circumcised. It gives us access to the Lord's table. And that's why the table is set before us as believers and given to us and not the world. Going back to Hebrews chapter 10 for just a moment, it says that we enter into the presence of God in a new and a living way. What is the new and the living way that he's talking about that gives us access to that bridal chamber, that Kodesh HaKodeshim, that Holy of Holies? Well, very simply, we saw in John the 6th chapter that Jesus didn't speak of himself as only the bread, but he says, I am, verse 51 says, I am the what? Living bread. And if you go back to Luke chapter 22, it says, and after Jesus had taken bread, he said, after the supper, he also took the cup. Now notice what he says about the cup. He said, this cup is the what? New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. So what's the new and living way that he's given to us to come into his bridal chamber? The new and living way. We come when we have communion by the living bread and the cup of the New Testament. Oh, but Brother Reuben, I thought we had access to the Holy of Holies. That all we had to do is come to the throne room. No, there's a cleansing. You can't come before God and not be cleansed. God is a holy God. He will not permit this uncleanness. Oh, well, what does that have to do with communion? If you go to 1 Corinthians for just a moment, chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul tells us, he said in verse 7, he said, purge out therefore the old leaven, which means uncleanness, that you may be a new lump, as you were unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. He's referring to the agape love feast. He's saying there's a cleansing that goes on in the presence of God. There's a cleansing that goes on in the bread and the wine. I don't understand it fully. All I can tell you is it works. It works. We could go on forever tonight on the table of the Lord, and I want to finish with one portion before we get into making love with Jesus, that koinonia. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 16, we began tonight with the very first church, and we're going to end with the last church that is mentioned in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 14. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 14. It concerns the last church that is mentioned. The first church, it said they'd left their first love. What's the first love? Protos agape, love feast. Now notice what happens here in verse 14. Remember, verse 14 begins the last church, chapter 3, verse 14. But notice, it is not addressing the world. It is not addressing the unbeliever. It is to the believer, because the message says, unto the angel of the church